Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. I'm Omega of Studio Omega, and today we'll be reviewing and discussing Final Fantasy XIV, the Tabletop RPG. Yes, they released this a little while ago, and I wanted to make a video about it. But first, let's do some normal preamble type stuff. So, if you're new to the channel, you're seeing this randomly pop up in your recommendeds. Hey, hi, thanks. But it's not our normal style of video. I've gotten further away from this type of tabletop RPG content for a few years, but I have done stuff like this before. Hopefully now with, a few more years of practice and making better production quality in there. But basically, we're going to be going through the standard rulebook, which in my notes is in all caps, and studying, reviewing the mechanics, talking about them, discussing, what's cool, what's not cool, mostly what's cool, because it's a pretty nice system. And the idea is to raise awareness of this game, which, like I said, I think is cool, but I don't know how popular it's gotten in TTRPG spaces. And also, this video kind of started as an excuse for me to read the book cover to cover and take lots of reference pictures for it, so that I could work up towards running it as a game master. Hi, game master here. And this is because there's no PDF form of these books, which for a tabletop based on an MMO is a little weird. It does make virtual tabletop tough, but not impossible. I've been doing VTT since the Skype days, okay, way before it was cool. But with that out of the way, I'm hoping you will all join me for a look at the standard rulebook of the Final Fantasy Tabletop RPG after a word from our sponsor. Ha! This joke is brought to you by our patrons over on Patreon, who also support this video. I'll talk more about that at the end of the video. And so, let us begin at the beginning. Final Fantasy Tabletop RPG book was released in September of 2025. The standard rulebook is pictured here. They also have a starter set, and as of the time the script is being written, the Game Master's book is upcoming. Actually, spoilers, it's out and I have it, but we'll talk more about that at the end. And they've just announced a Stormblood expansion book, which, as of the time I wrote this script and am recording this script, is also still not out. The standard edition book is 320 pages and 12 chapters, plus the usual what is an RPG, here's what you need preamble that isn't even a numbered chapter. And we'll be breaking down all of them for the video, some more than others. There will be others that are, more detail-oriented. But I'll insert some B-roll of the physical book with a voiceover I've taken of it right about now. And so you can see the book right here. It's a lovely hardcover, great production value, glossy pages. It's packed with art, though it's mostly reused from the MMO. But you can see with the video I took some of the different sections, some of the art pieces, things about the playable races, the playable classes, jobs, etc., etc. The shots of Catgirls and Warrior are completely unintentional. So we start at getting started, naturally. We start the book off by defining the basic terms, the game master, the players, the player characters, etc., etc. We specify the dice. You'll need some d20s and some d6s, so while it's not an SRD game, it is d20 adjacent if you have friends who only play D&D. We describe the basic flow of play, and we talk about the golden rule, which is that we're all here to collaborate and have fun. The GM's supposed to be the arbiter, but hypothetically, you're supposed to be playing a game all together as friends. Shocking, I know. It describes the basic mechanics of roll a d20, add some stuff, beat the challenge rating, CR is what it's called. It describes basic difficulties in a table from 5, easy, to 30, nearly impossible. That basically tells you all the scope we're looking at in this game. This game does have advantage dice, similar to advantage in D&D, but that's where you roll multiple d20s at once and pick whichever one you want to use. And you can also have both positive modifiers and penalties. You never take disadvantage dice. Advantage dice is always just you get to roll more d20s and pick the one you want to use. This section and chapter also talks about when to roll dice and when not to roll checks, a piece of advice that I think is very critical for many RPGs. It describes the adventurers who constitute the player characters. It briefly talks about the jobs and the 3 main roles, tank, healer, and DPS, and it will describe the attributes that you all possess as your basic stats. I will go over those in a second slide. And it ends with some very basic boilerplate questions about your adventure to get that minimum amount of character building in, but it's mostly just to kind of tickle your brain so you know what you're doing. Actual character generation is follow-up chapters and has more detail. As you can see from my handy-dandy bullet points, you have 5 primary attributes Usually these are the things you're going to be rolling. That'll be your strength, dexterity, vitality, int, intelligence, and mind. Yes, mind and int are different. If you're curious, actually, mind is more of a perception or what D&D would think of as wisdom type stat. It's your instincts, ability to perceive your surroundings. Anyway, each of these primary attributes come with a description for when you will be using them, because obviously this is the mechanic that your GM will be calling on for you to do certain things outside of combat and various other parts of the gameplay, the role-playing part. Then you have your secondary attributes. This includes your defense and magic defense. This is your challenge rating when targeted by abilities. Also takes note of your speed, how many squares you move. Yes, also, we should say this now. This is a squares-based game, just like Final Fantasy Tactics. But, yes, you will be needing some squares, which is, again, why I comment about the VTT stuff a lot. But you also have your vigilance, which is kind of your passive perception. The GM gives you more info based on how high your vigilance is. At certain thresholds, you may get more information in pre-made scenarios and so on and so forth. Now, most of these stats are either directly set by or are modified by your job. They are separate from kind of your intrinsic permanent abilities, which I think is very interesting and may tweak some people, but I don't think is actually a problem in the overall. But it also talks about your abilities. Abilities is a very broad category, which is basically specific actions and spells you have. These are also usually set by your job. You usually just have your job-specific abilities, but you can acquire special abilities during a scenario. Think the duty actions in the MMO. And also, you can acquire temporary or permanent abilities through other certain interactions, like some items or equipment might give you a special ability while they are equipped. Even minions and titles can give you abilities permanently, which we'll talk about more. And these special scenario abilities usually don't carry over. They are usually specific to the story of that scenario, but they can carry over, giving your game master the ability to give you, permanent new abilities added to your character for certain story clears. In general, I would say, this is me editorializing, by the way, so if it sounds less polished, I'm going off script. But to editorialize, something I didn't think of while writing the script, but I'm thinking of as I'm rereading it and saying it out loud. This game, while I do like it for campaign play, and obviously, you have to have those sorts of building blocks and tools, many more of which are in the Game Master's Guide. But in general, this game also seems like it was designed a little bit to be playable at conventions. There are a lot of talk about if you are playing a player character but moving groups or GMs, or, playing through pre-made scenarios, what kind of things you'll need to be doing. Makes me wonder, I guess we'll see at upcoming events, but makes me feel that, they designed this with the idea that you might be playing this at tables at, a fan fest or something. Chapter 2, Character Creation, is naturally next. It begins with a summary of the character sheet. It shows an image of the blank sheet in the back of the book with those little number guides to tell you what each part is and describe them. It describes then how to make characters. There are pre-mades in the back of the book, or you can use them just as examples. And you can make a PC either by choosing various options, or each step does have a random table you can roll. This again kind of goes back to that comment I made at the end of the last bit, editorializing, that lots of this feel like they're designed for convention games, which is certainly a style. I think it's a little outmoded in current year, but it is interesting to see that there's a lot of these simplified random tables, so if you have that one player who just refuses to make a decision, you can make them roll a d6, and then if they roll a 6, they have to choose anyway. But in a big case of knowing their audience, the first actual discussion in this section, besides just summaries, is appearance, including reminding you that glamour prisms are canon, so you can look however you like, including a random style and visual quirk table. Yeah, you can roll on a table and get anywhere from minimalist to arcane to techwear. Pretty typical stuff. That said, I don't really know why this is called a chapter, other than that structurally it is a chapter, because it's very short and it's mainly just a holding area for directing you into other areas, because we immediately move into Chapter 3. In that case, Chapter 3, Profiles, and forgive the blurry header here, it's not that important right now, but some of these pictures are not great. Anyway, this is kind of the real character chapter. The profile parts of an adventurer contains your character's concept and backstory, and does actually have mechanical impact, more so even than your race, to be sure. And you develop your profile in 3 steps. You've got a concept and backstory, your profile trait, and your starting title, then you flesh out the rest. If you're having trouble making your character concept and backstory, they have a 3-step method to use, which contains, your origin, your motives, your bonds, and random example tables for each. We'll talk about that in the next section. I got a slide for that. I can say that a lot. And I'll do the same for describing how the profile trait works, but I will explain here that that is a unique ability you get to have advantage from your backstory. Your backstory actually influences your character in this setting to actually get, some mechanical uniqueness when you're not just standing and hitting things. You also get a starting title. Yes, so to explain that, the tabletop RPG assumes that you are starting at level 30 already, so you have a title. You also already have your jobstone or equivalent, no starter classes in this. And yes, your titles do have mechanical advantages. You can choose not to use a title, and you can have as many titles as you like, but you can only make use of a title at a time. And you can only swap your title at a appropriate downtime moment, usually when you take a rest or you sleep. So, for example, you've got, a blank adventurer from a particular region, so you can get back HP during a phase. You can increase your vigilance passively with a title, which is cute, and stuff like that. In fact, one of the titles is even Tenacious, which is you don't get the weakness status effect when you recover from being KO'd. That's very cute. Now, other than the other slides to discuss the specific mechanical systems in this section, we're going to talk about the rest of the details in this chapter now, because the rest of Chapter 3 is just a large collection of charts breaking down the example names for all the various races and subspecies, and then over 10 pages of some great work discussing the naming conventions for each race and how they work. It's wonderful world building and flavor. Like, genuinely, I didn't actually see a disclaimer. Several parts of the book say that they lifted the text from the Eorzea Encyclopedia. I don't remember if those sections here for names? No, the naming tables aren't. Oh, okay. So they say that a lot of this is from the Lodestone, the official 14 website. But still, if you are wondering about how to name your Warrior of Light in the MMO, there's a lot of great material on it here, and it also doubles for naming your adventurer in the tabletop RPG. So let's talk about what they describe as their 3-step method to creating your adventurer, because while the naming conventions, descriptions, and tables are really cool, it's hard to boil all those down. Just, you can figure out how to do, Lalafell names in your own time. But the 3-step method is pretty simple. It starts with origin, motive, and then bond. The origin is supposed to reflect your roots and upbringing, where you come from. Motive is obviously why you are an adventurer. And then bond is a personal connection to Eorzea. Each has a random table for you to roll or pick off of, and including in the bond, you get some very fun character options to give you connections. For example, obviously you have, the heads of the Adventurers Guild in respective city-states, like Modi, Mother Miyun, Boulder on 10 Fingers, etc. But, it can include guildmasters, various small faction leaders. By the way, Rowan and Geralt are both on this list separately. Hildebrand's even on this list. Have fun with that. But the origin tables and the motive tables are much more direct. Character bond is, a D20 table. The other two are D6s. They're pretty straightforward. You can, work to pick if you're from a city-state, if you're from the provinces, whatever. Your motivations can be pretty simple. And obviously all of these have an option, which is just like, it's a secret. So the profile trait, though, is a way to get advantage dice, which is granted by your backstory. There are examples pictured here. Obviously they are a little blurry, but I will, reiterate some of them. But basically all of them follow the same mechanical circumstance. It's just they come in a couple different formats. No matter what, all this does is get you one advantage die when you're rolling certain checks, but how they give them have different narrative restrictions. The way they break it down is either you have one major and one minor restriction, or 3 minor restrictions. The examples they give of that when telling you how to build your own is you have advantage with townspeople, minor restriction, in Idleshire, major restriction, because Idleshire is only one settlement. The alternative for 3 minor is gain advantage while you're in a forest, thinking about flora at night, okay? And they have random tables to help you go through, conditions, regions, terrains, etc., kind of describing and explaining it. The examples they give that you can kind of see in this image are stuff like perfect recall. You can remember, anything you've seen, you've encountered. Basically, get one advantage die on something you've seen, heard, read, or experienced, so it only works if you've already done it. Or You can have Indomitable, get an advantage on checks to endure pain or push your body past its natural limits, etc. So, the kind of stuff that lots of RPGs have a unique talent that's, should be, anyway, just yours, and does give you a mechanical benefit. You're gonna just have to believe me that this is from the Chapter 4 opening page. Trust. Anyway, Chapter 4, Races, is pretty straightforward. Basically, the way it works is that it's got a page dedicated to each playable race you can select in the MMO, including both sub-races. It includes their classical key art, it has descriptions of their physicality and their culture. It's pretty normal stuff if you've been playing the MMO, but it does add a good depth for the RP if it is admittedly Eorzea-centric from where it's been replicated from. But at the end, it does also have an interesting section because it discusses races which are not normally playable in the MMO. This includes both allied tribes and just other guys who are around. And since there's no mechanics involved in picking a race, including those formerly classified as beast tribes, they're all valid choices, and this includes even some of the sub-races you find in, like, Doma or Ivalice, getting ahead of the fact that they didn't even have the Stormblood book announced yet. Obviously, there are going to be some cases where, like, there are size categories, so your GM might prevent you from playing, like, a Sylph because you're small and can fly. But generally, if you're, like, people-sized, there's no actual mechanical rule that says you can't be, an Ixal Paladin or whatever. At the end of the section, it does also talk about mechanical classifications of creatures, which can, as you might expect, have some sort of interaction with the mechanics. What qualifies as, like, seedkin versus wavekin type shit, and how that works out. It's not perfect, but since that is one of the things that can influence your profile trait in the previous chapter, it's good to get ahead. And there will be small interactions with, like, narrative abilities or special titles and stuff you can acquire later. Now, Chapter 5 is Jobs, and it is a big one. I know, job application jump scare. But first, it discusses the roles. The roles are Tank, DPS, and Healer, and yes, I will be listing the jobs and discussing lots of stuff in another slide. It also talks about how a light party is made up of exactly 1 Tank, 1 Healer, and 2 DPS, normally. It does also specify that the party level should be evened out, and usually that's going to be set by the GM based on what they have planned. Again, talking a little bit about like scenario play and convention play sort of a thing, but also just in general, like, you can't show up and be like, I'm level 50, and everybody else is like, we're level 30. Generally, you start your career in the TTRPG at 30, and the cap is 60 because all of this content is through Heavensward. Now, there is a small sidebar about non-standard party comp. It reminds you that this is a tabletop RPG, so you can do what you like. Obviously, most TTRPG diehards will already know this, but this is important if you're making the jump to pen and paper from the MMO. You don't have to play it exactly as a light role. You can have more than 4 characters in a light party. You can mess with the roles. You can use companions, which are explained in a later chapter, to kind of flesh out if you have fewer than 4 players and don't have enough roles, and so on and so forth. It does make sure to warn you that most material which is pre-written for the game is balanced around the classical light party. It does, however, though, mention that unlike a lot of other RPGs, though of course very much like Final Fantasy, jobs are not supposed to be fixed. Hypothetically, you can swap at any time, but actually swapping does involve a lot of bookkeeping, so doing it mid-session is not recommended. But it does say that if you want to go whole hog to do that, snap transition, you can prepare multiple character sheets so you can swap on the fly. The rest of the chapter focuses on discussing, or I should say the rest of the chapter intro focuses on discussing the concept of soul crystals and using them in the tabletop RPG. It quotes several passages from the Eorzea Encyclopedia about them, and does come up with several explanations for how your character might have them. They are supposed to be relatively rare for most Eorzean-focused jobs, though obviously this is not always true. One of the examples in the books is straight up like, hey, if you're playing Machinist, they've literally invented and mass-produced a new soul crystal to put all Machinists kind of on the same level, sort of a thing. So, the assumption is going to be that you are going to be getting your job abilities from a soul crystal, and there's several ways you can have gotten one. And what you see here is a list of all the jobs and their roles in the standard rulebook, which is basically everything up through Heavensward 3.0 in real-life, real-time MMO terms. DPS is typically subdivided into melee, ranged, and magic. Don't really worry about that. That's not very much a big deal, and there's less emphasis on it, I would say, in this game. You do still have roll actions on some level buried into most of your roll jobs, but they are less emphatic than needed, but they are still shared traits. Also, note we're at jobs because the minimum level, as I said before, is 30. You are already assumed to have a job stone, a soul crystal, and there is currently no support for base classes starting at level 1 because, well, gonna be real, you're not gonna have a lot of things to do. I'll probably reiterate this once we go through the actual combat chapter, but there isn't a basic attack, auto attacks modeled in this, so if you were level 1, you would literally have one button, and that's not really that entertaining. But before we get into your actual jobs, the chapter, I should say, teach you about how to read your job's information, how to record it on your separate character sheet, and go on from there. Your job sets your baseline core stats. They can be modded by various things, but your attributes, both primary and secondary, will be set usually by your job's overall effects. Though again, MP is usually flat, but you can improve it minorly in a couple of ways. And you also have select passive traits and, of course, your list of active abilities. We do get a brief section telling you to handle each role, basically. Tanks generate enmity, which force enemies to target them. Note that enmity is very tabletop RPG here. You can, still attack somebody who doesn't have enmity. You're just usually going to have a bad time, so it's a useful toolkit for both players and GM to play with. Healers heal, obviously, but need to mind their MP. It's a very important resource for them. And DPS are designed to do damage, but because they are more fragile, they need to watch their HP levels and their placement. Except, of course, for ranged DPS, you obviously have a lot of maximum range, so you should focus more on your utility and using all your various tools to the best of your ability. Jobs may have unique resources, of course, which you can track on your sheet. Yes, you do actually have little resource boxes you tick up as you get charges and stuff. And there are a couple of traits which are shared between jobs, which is namely the idea of combo and the idea of pets. Basically, a couple of classes, it's Scholar and Arcanist, have pets that they, have specific unique mechanics to the pet, but are shared between the class. And every class basically has this combo idea, which is that if you have an ability that has a combo after it, you can immediately do that ability regardless of action economy stuff. We'll discuss that more in a future chapter. But then the rest of this chapter is taken up with detailed description of each job, its abilities and traits, and how they flow mechanically. Genuinely, I could probably do a video about each single class and kind of its leveling curve and what it wants to be doing, because they are mechanically distinct. But, one, that's not going to make a lot of sense without going through the combat stuff later in this core book. And so in this video, we're going to do a bare minimum and speed run kind of each job's feel and abilities from level 30 to 60. And I'll save, future tabletop job guides for later videos, which you may or may not click on. So, tanks, starting there, just because that's how my notes are organized. So, Paladin is kind of more of a supportive and control type tank. They get access to an extra stun with their shield bash, and they have a lot of utility to negate hits, both on themselves and for allies to, redirect them to be, say, direct hits or not direct hits, to reduce stuff for allies as well. They've got, at higher levels, Divine Veil to give everybody a shield. They have, of course, their, iconic cover ability to literally redirect damage from allies. And also, at higher levels, they get access to Clemency, so they can act as healers in an emergency and actually spend their MP that way. So, that's pretty interesting. The main thing is that their resource of Conviction is just generated passively every turn. You get one per turn because you can't auto-attack. And all of their, extra damage abilities are usually once per phase. So you have, pretty simple either single target or AoE combo, and you have a couple of once per phase abilities. Capping out at level 60, you don't get access to, Paladin's, MMO late game burst yet. It'll be interesting to see kind of how that shapes up with the releases of the books and whatnot. But yeah, for now, they're kind of in that position. I forgot to mention it earlier in the script, but limit breaks are unique to each class in this, so everyone is slightly different. The LB for Paladin is Last Bastion. It halves all incoming damage from an attack, targeting one or more allies. It gives all those allies big heals, and then also, removes a debuff and stuff. Now, Warrior, on the other hand, is more self-sufficient, as you might expect if you know the MMO. They provide themselves with a little bit of self-healing reliably, and they have several ways to buff their damage output. At level 30, you're starting with their basic Berserk ability you can do a couple of times per phase. And their basic combo actions grant them their Wrath stacks, which you then spend on their higher DPS abilities. So instead of being like once per phase bonus damage, like off cooldowns, you have resource-based abilities, so you can, cycle through to them to do your higher DPS more consistently depending on how long the abilities last. And their, self-buff grants them minimum damage, basically. You can only roll minimum numbers on your damage dice. The downside is that being only at level 60, they don't really have a lot of their buffs and support for allies at this level. They can't, really offset damage for other allies besides the roll abilities, and don't have access to like the AoE or targeted heals that they do at like higher levels in the MMO. So you got to keep that in mind. Dark Knight kind of... Oh, actually, I should say, before I move to Dark Knight, the Lambent Break 4 Warrior is Land Waker. That redirects an attack to them, reduces its damage, and then deals the damage you take back to the enemy. So that kind of explains like why they are that way. They have a revenge-based LD. Dark Knight does kind of split the difference, though, between Paladin and Warrior. They actively spend and regenerate MP to use abilities, dealing extra damage and to trigger their Dark Side buff. Their Dark Side condition basically makes your attacks all or nothing. Basically, they literally do... Each damage die literally either deals 0 or 10 damage as kind of so your damage heights get bigger, but your damage shortfalls can get smaller. And they do have some unique utility and, like, area control, because you may notice that in the MMO currently, Warrior and Paladin are the ones who get their dashes late and kept them as attacks. Yeah, so this is based on like not even Endwalker, Dawn Trail like changes. So at the levels you can reach in the core book, Dark Knights get their dash, they get Shadow Stride, and they also get access to Salted Earth, which does create like an area on the ground that enemies are damaged in. So you do get some interesting abilities to work out there. The main thing is that you want to keep in mind is they have access to very limited abilities to mitigate damage at this level. They can't cast the Blackest Night at this level, for instance. So their damage mitigation is limited to just a couple of their normal ones in rotation, and they have to make up for it by using careful choice of their abilities, which regenerate HP a lot. You have access to Carve and Split and stuff, so you can work with that. And the interesting case is, I didn't mention it because I'm hoping it's kind of a given, but I'll say it now because it works as a contrast. Paladin has access to Hallowed Ground, which is just like, become invincible, don't take damage for a little bit. And Holmgang is, you can't be reduced below 1 HP for a little bit. So the limit break for Dark Knight is Dark Force, and that gives you a proper invul because Living Dead is still Living Dead, so it's kind of complicated. There's a whole phase of like, you can't die, but if you get reduced to 1 HP... you enter a phase where you self-regen a lot of HP, but if you don't fully heal yourself, you fucking die. You pass out. So that's still in Dark Knight and is a little complicated. And to make up for it, let me read you straight from the source. Dark Force prevents all damage and enfeeblements of the effect that would have triggered it on the target. So that's like a full invul for you or anybody. You can just be like, nah. Proper tanking LBs and stuff. Now, on the healer side, White Mage is basically what you would expect. It's a Kier smorgasbord. You have a variety of single-target and AoE heals to access. You also have access to regens. The buff is called Revivify in the system, but it's the regen spell in the other ones. And these are all across your primary, secondary, and instant abilities. We'll talk a little bit more about the action economy later, but having multiples is good. Take my word for it. And because you have access to Presence of Mind at these levels, you basically have an extra swift cast, so you can cast a lot of abilities very rapidly and move up and down, and you can still do damage with your normal abilities. You can apply a dot, and you can do normal damage effects, and you can, in fact, apply the Holy. What's the downside? What's not to like? Well, as a White Mage, kind of true to the lore and to some levels of the class, you gotta manage your MP very carefully. Increasing your rate of MP regen is tough in the game. You kind of have as much as you have, and you can only regenerate it so fast. Usually you're only getting like 1 point back at the end of each, turn. So you're going to have to use, at higher levels, abilities like Size and Thin Air to manage your MP, or you're going to have to chug a lot of ethers. On the plus side, you can actually chug ethers pretty reliably in this system as opposed to in the MMO, so you can get there. And their Limit Break Pulse of Life is a right proper healer LB3. It's going to restore all allies in the encounter to full HP and MP and remove all of their debuffs. This also, I will double check, but I'm pretty sure it even revives them as well. Yes, can remove knocked out, weakness, and brink of death. So that means that if you are knocked out, you're good. If you have been resuscitated already but have the weakness debuff, you're good. And it removes brink of death, which is a condition for you've had your ass beat too many times and you're gonna die. So pretty solid stuff, Now, Scholar is a different beast. They have EOs to do extra work. We'll talk about pets a little bit later because they have some shared mechanics. But in general, Eos' main thing is that she's going to be doing extra heals, basically, on your turn. And it means that while you lack the raw healing potential of a white mage, you make up for it by having access to a couple of extra combat spells. You have some extra resources to spend to deal some damage, while Eos is, like I said, passively healing your allies. And eventually you gain a unique resource in Aether Flow, which starts at full, and you can use that to supplement your offense and defense, which includes also unique strategic abilities you'd expect from Scholar. Having access to a couple of moves that you would expect to be utilizing, like, deployment tactics and emergency tactics type stuff. Also, yes, they have shields. They have loads of shields. Real big on barrier casting. Their LB, Angel Feathers, is a party-wide heal, not a full heal, but is a big heal. And then also... Oh, wait, no. Yes, I'm sorry. I read that wrong. It is a full heal, and then it grants them a huge barrier. It also removes all debuffs. The flip side for... The difference from between Pulse of Life and Angel Feathers is Pulse of Life also gets you full MP. That's right. So it's a full reset. A resetti. Spaghetti. Astrologian then once again kind of plays as the later job, the Split the Difference class. They do have a unique ability, which isn't even an action, it is just a trait at their starting level called Play Arcana, which is at the start of your turn, you're going to give any single ally you pick a barrier of 1 HP, and then also they get the ability to re-roll a damage die. So you are constantly doing a tiny amount of shield and doing kind of generally making your damage numbers better as Astro. The one downside I will say of this is, I hope they do kind of work this out, is in the MMO, drawing and playing cards gets your MP back. That doesn't happen when you use the Play Arcana effect. So you gotta be careful with your selection here of abilities. But other than that, you do have, not just the regular buffs, but you have light speed for extra casting, just like Presence of Mind, and you have, in addition to, the full suite of being able to do the normal, couple of combat buttons, couple of basic, single target AoE heals, and other stuff going on there, you also have access to a lot of funny reactive abilities through stuff like Divination, Celestial Opposition, Collective Unconsciousness, right? Those are reactive abilities that you get to do to tie some stuff together, so you have some flexibility with your, fortune-telling shtick. For instance, Synastry, which is an ability which can be good or bad to use depending on the MMO, depending on what you're set up. The way that works in this is it's a instant ability, so it's basically a reaction whenever an ally is going to recover HP. You pick a different ally, and then whenever any ally is healed, Synastry heals them half the HP, so you can spread it around a little. Stuff like that is nice. But like I said, without extra MP management abilities, and I don't want to get into homebrewing and stuff, I'd have to actually see on the table if Astro is really tough with it compared to say White Mage. There are ways to kind of fix it, but for now, like I said, you have less tools to deal with the MP cutting you in, so keep that in mind. And their LB is Astral Stasis. It's pretty simple. You remove all the debuffs and you fully restore HP, and then you also grant every ally Major Arcana for the turn. So you give them, full heal, remove debuffs, and you smack them with a damage modifier. So, the melee DPS, and there's 3 of these. It's funny because we start with Monk in the book, and Monk is immediately very complicated. You have a lot of resources you need to keep track of, including your various stances and forms in the character sheet and the material provided. In your trait boxes, you have lots of little boxes you need to fill out what you're working on. You have your meditations, etc. But basically, while you're in one of your forms, one of your martial forms, you get advantage on 1 attack per round. When you have a resource called Fury, the Bestial Fury, you can spend it for extra damage and mobility. like basically you do like a d6 extra damage and then you scoot a couple squares, and you can get it at higher levels. The damage numbers usually increase proportionally. Otherwise, besides the fact that you do have a lot of bookkeeping to do because you have to manually track your stances and furies and meditations going off, Monk is basically a blitz class. Their core primary ability, Monk Combo, lets you basically do the literal text of it, I should say, is do 3 primary attacks after this. So just after you do this, you can perform up to 3 primary actions, which can only be used for physical attacks. And then basically, you string together your huge list of primary melee moves, your primary melee abilities, into literal fighting game combos. You move through them in order to gather resources, switch stances, spend resources, and do a lot of damage. Later, they can get additional damage by spending chakra, they can add dashes, and they can even add kind of extra healing for the team with mantra. And when you get into their like higher level resources, their special like masterful blitz moves are really powerful, but you have to set them up accordingly. So it requires some brain power, but it can be really rewarding because you get to do like lots of dope monk shit. The main downside, just like the MMO, you literally have no ranged attacks. You have to rely on AoEs or bonus mobility. Obviously, like, you can get a couple of extra squares of movements by using your furies to, like, punch, scoot, punch some more. But if an enemy, like, literally does the MMO boss thing where he, like, flies to the far end of the arena, you're gonna have to, like, spend your D&D-ass 6 squares movements to hustle after him before you can punch him. So you do gotta keep that in mind. And their limit break is very simple. It's called Final Heaven, and all it says is it's an anytime trigger, and it just lets you do a primary action. So you can, if you have a limit break as a monk, you can, whenever you like, basically spend one of your limit breaks to immediately do a single primary action. You can't, I'm pretty sure anyway, I'll double check the FAQ later, but I'm pretty sure at this reading you can't use it for monk combo, because monk combo says that this turn you can take additional actions. If you're using Final Heaven not on your turn, you can't do that, and you're only ever supposed to, use each action so many times. But hypothetically, you could probably use it because monk combo itself is not a physical primary action, so you can't monk combo for more monk combos. You could probably, on your turn, do your full monk combo and then just be like, limit break, I'm gonna monk combo again. But out of your turn, you can only use it for one attack. Dragoon is, funnily enough, showing no bias here, definitely not biased. Do not look at my stream archives. Don't watch my VODs. Actually do. But Dragoon's a lot simpler and much more flexible in the kind of like, not necessarily in the way what you do. Monk is very flexible in that you get to choose how to basically build your combo each turn. But Dragoon has a variety of options to do different types of things right out the gate. You start very early with both the once per phase jump damage and then also Piercing Talon as just a permanent ability you can do to anybody within 5 squares of you. So you've got your handful of basic attacks for your combos. The Dragoon combo doesn't go, crazy style at only level 60. You don't get the full weaving back and forth effect, but you do get the branching combo. You go True Thest, and then you either pick Vorpal or Full or Disembowel Chaos Thrust to get some bonus attacks. You do get Fang and Claw Wheeling Thrust, but they don't get their extra, both of them, basically. But that can be used to generate additional damage and self-healing very easily, but also they have great mobility abilities both to and from enemies. You get the Dragon Glide, the Winged Glide ability, as an instant to just move 5 squares. Whenever anybody starts a turn, you can move to them. By the way, I'm pretty sure that the current version of Dragon Glide is enemies only, so technically the version in the tabletop RPG lets you dash to allies too. It's just like, your ally starts a turn and you're just like, oh, hey, I want to be over there. But you also get access to stuff like Elusive Jump as a secondary ability to, move in a direction unless you critically fumble it, and then your GM gets to pick where you land. Very funny ability. But you can go back and forth. The downside is that you have very limited AoE abilities. You, once again, only go up to enough levels in Dragoon to get just Doom Spike, so no AoE combo, and Dragon Fire Dive is once per phase, as is Gerskogel, the line attack. You're also not high enough level to get, Eyes of the Brood and stuff, so you have some abilities which are limited to once per phase, but you still can activate the Blood of the Dragon effect to passively damage enemies that move close to you. And your party buff, Battle Litany, specifically has the ability to let your allies fish for crits, because it... let me see. Check the exact wording, since I have the book handy. But it is Battle Litany. Value of any die that landed on 1 when making ability check. No, increase the ability, the die by 1, if you're determining if you crit or not. Or make a direct hit. So yeah, Battle Litany is just like one time everybody in the radius gets to increase a die by a little bit to see if it procs a direct hit and a crit. You get +1s, basically. So you have some ability to support your friends. You have access to not just Bloodbath, but a couple of different health regenerating abilities as Dragoon. And like I said, you have very unique mobility to move in and out, which is nice. Their limit break is Dragon Song Dive, and it is exactly what you are expecting at that name. You do a big jump. Well, technically, you do big damage to a target, then you jump to an empty square next to them. And it's anybody within 5, so, you do a big bonk and then move. And then we go back to Ninja, so Ninja goes back to being complicated again. The way Ninja works is you're going to do your abilities to your Sineweaver passive, you stockpile Mudra, and you can stock 1 at first, and then at higher levels you can get 2, 3, etc. But you do different moves to stock, or different secondary abilities to stockpile Mudra, then you spend your Mudra on Ninjutsu, but you can't Ninjutsu all the time. Each specific Ninjutsu ability, it's like a subtable, based on how many squares, how many Mudra you can spend. It's always 1 or more, so you can always choose to Fuma Shuriken, even if you can stockpile more Mudra. It's just that you're going to spend all of your Mudras whenever you Ninjutsu. But each individual Ninjutsu has a trait called Ninjutsu Cooldown, which means basically until you do a different Ninjutsu... Actually, no, yeah, it's not even that way. It's just you're locked to 1 Ninjutsu per turn, so even if you get other primary abilities, you can't combo extra ones. So it's more of a secondary cooldown. You can't string together multiples and do extra ninjutsus ever, and you can't use your ninjutsus all the time. You have to stockpile your mudras through stuff like ritual weaves and whatnot. And you lose your mudras if you do stuff that's not ritual weaving. So you have to do primary then mudras, or you gotta wait for it to come back. So basically, you have to slowly build it or settle for small chip damage, but if you do get to 2 or 3 Mudra, those ninjutsus are very strong. You get access to multiple types of AoE, single target damages, etc. You can buff yourself or inflict debuffs on enemies. Like Hyoton, for instance, actually does bind targets, reducing their movement and stuff. The other abilities you can get, you can worry about a special hidden status effect, which doesn't actually make you untargetable, but it's basically like sneak attack damage in other games. You get bonus damage when you are hidden and can make yourself hidden through certain abilities, but you don't, you aren't literally hidden. It's not the actual becoming invisible part. And the other abilities you have are just, your normal extra damages. You can, throw some Death Blossoms. You got your basic combos in there, and you can do a few other unique utilities to kind of make enemies, more off balance. You can mug, just like in the MMO, to mean that all that damage takes +1 damage from everything, so on and so forth. Your LB is Chimatsuri, which is a super short range attack. It's 1 square away, but it does a shitload of damage to the target and immediately sets up your hidden. So yes, in general, overall, melee DPS is focused on usually lots of resource management, with the exception of Dragoon. Dragoon is fairly straightforward. I think even after they increase the levels, you will not be super crazy. It'll be just more like what kind of extra combos you can go into. But the other ones kind of have more intense resources to manage and keep track of, but the flip side of that is that you get really, really good damage out of it, and the thing about Ninja is that setting up for, if you're pulling off your Mudras and you're popping ninjutsus, most of those have a range of a few squares as well, so you aren't as distance limited as Monk is. Okay, that was long. This time we're going to talk about 4 jobs, because we're going to do ranged and magical DPS on the same slide instead of notes, because there's only 2 of them and they'd still be short. But we're going to try and make that move a little faster. Bard doesn't do a lot of direct damage overall. They have only a couple of basic primary attacks, but they do have 2 major tricks or gimmicks to doing damage, which is that with the Arrow Flurry trait, they can stack primary attacks together. Normally you're only supposed to do one primary, so you can sometimes, if you get the right procs, do multiple primary attacks separate from combo type stuff, thanks to their arrow flurry and their ability to do a couple of repeats with like barrage once per phase. And the other thing is that they have a lot of instant abilities which are reactive to kind of do chip damage to enemies outside of turn. These usually cost resources or are limited in some way, but like I said, it means that you are reactive to enemies doing things to fire at them. Also, at the beginning of their turn, they get to kind of sing for free, which can buff allies and do a couple of different things depending, and use that to stack up stuff. The downside is that if you're talking about action economy, they basically have no secondary abilities. Both of them are pretty limited to just Raging Strikes and then Warden's Pan to remove debuffs. So you're going to be trying to set up a lot of primary ability combos, or you're going to be doing instants not on your turn, basically. Their limit break is Sagittarius Arrow, and it does form an infinite line attack, basically from you in like a 3-wide line to the end of the map, wherever that is, and evenly distributes damage amongst those enemies and gives them a big dot. That is another thing that these bards are very big about, is they have a primary ability to inflict a dot very steadily, and also have an ability which does damage at higher levels if the enemy has a dot. Good job, thumbs up. Machinist, on the other hand, is pretty simple in comparison. They gather basic resources, but they have an ability to do basically any number of instant abilities on their turn. Basically, normally you can only use instants, once per turn when you meet the trigger condition. The flip side for Machinist is they get to use any number of instant abilities, but they expend resources. They only have so many charges built up, but you can gather those resources to spend them together for a few different tricks. You also have a couple of other neat tricks, like the overheat mechanic lets that you target the lower of the target's physical or magic defense, and then that lets you use your additional damaging abilities to recover your, number of charges of your instants, like Ricochet and Gauss Shot. They also do get a turret buddy. They get a little summon. No Automaton Queen yet, but they do get a little turret to do extra damage. Not quite a pet, but a little, extra thing. And their LB is just Satellite Beam, which just deals a shitload of damage to everybody in a line. Pivoting to casters, Black Mage is about what you'd expect. You switch between Astral Fire for more damage, and then Umbral Ice to regain MP. While you're in Astral Fire, you do not get the passive MP gain. So you move back and forth, and you set up your dots with the thunders in between. You get the ability to slam multiple primary spells per turn, so long as you don't move. Normally you can do extra secondary abilities by focusing, but this lets you get extra primary so long as you're not doing your standard movement. And you do get a few tricks. You do, at high enough levels, get access to ley lines to make your spells a little more juicy, and get access to your Umbral Hearts at higher levels to cut down on MP costs for longer uptime. Meteor, their LB, is just big damage in a big circle. And Summoner is a pet class just like Scholar, and they also have Aether Flow, but their use of Aether Flow can be a little bit more flexible. They do have fewer spells than, say, Black Mage, but... Oh, actually, I should say not a but, as an and. They also have a harder time with multiple primary casts per turn. They don't get that ability, really. But they do have more instant abilities to inflict extra damage out of turn, and they do, at this level, have access to their equivalent of their burst mode in the MMO, the Dreadworm Trance. This gives you flight, it gives you extra damage. I'm realizing that in an earlier version of this, I accidentally wrote Arcanist instead of Summoner, and I don't know if I said it earlier, but I don't want to unravel the whole video when we're at like 45 minutes to figure it out. If I did, oops. Anyway, as I was saying correctly in this slide and in my notes about Summoner, you do get access to the shared Arcanist abilities, which is the Resurrection and the minor heal with Fizzing. It is very minor, but it's there. Now, the beauty of Summoner is that you do actually get to feel kind of like an old school Summoner because your pets are more variable. If Carbuncle is out, it gives you extra MP gen and small but reliable shields. Its, one pet ability is to give you a little barrier every turn. If you switch to Ifrit Eggy, that gives you more damage, hurts enemies he moves through, and its ability is a single target each turn. Titan Eggy reduces damage allies take in an area, gives you a smaller damage up, but it's flat instead of a rolled dice, and can do AoE damage as a regular attack. Garuda Eggy makes you faster, more speed, makes your attacks more accurate, and has the ability to splash multiple targets when you're under its effect, and also its basic ability is a ranged attack. Your limit break is Terra Flare. It does big AoE damage and then has extra effects based on which pet you currently have out. And I just double-checked, it lets you switch your pet until the start of your next turn as summoner. And also, not in my original notes, and I don't have a slide for it, but there is the table of your pet effects for both summoner and scholar at the end of this chapter. Okay, moving on from all of that. Chapter 6, Tools of the Trade. Sorry, this image is slightly skewed, but you can get the kind of idea we're going for here. It's annoying to keep taking the pictures, but again, no PDF, and I'm not gonna, like, futz with my book to get a normal scan. Anyway, in case you couldn't tell, Tools of the Trade is the Stuff chapter. It starts with a description of the fortune system, which the best way to describe is, if you've played the MMO, it basically takes your entire currency tab and makes it into one stat. The stat should roughly be set when you start your adventure by your starting level. It's 3 if you're level 30 and can go as high as 6. And typically it resets to 0 at the end of an adventure. Not necessarily implying that you blow all your money at the gold saucer, though yes, the book does call that out, but also could be just you invest it, you try to buy a house, you're doing it on other stuff, but it goes down. But also does note that this doesn't account if specifically an adventure or scenario gives you a reward. If you're playing adventures in sequence or you're playing with the same gaming group over and over again, trying to make sure that you're, not cheating in, like, organized play type stuff, you can carry over that level, though I would guess the implication is that you count up those rewards from 0. The primary thing I think they're getting at is you start the scenario with X number of fortune based on your level, and you do not carry over that stuff if you didn't spend all of it. So make sure you're spending your money in a scenario, because you don't know if you're going to get more. There'll be some more stuff about making fortune and using it later. But for roleplay purposes, they do mention that most characters will have packs full of adventuring supplies, which is basically all the basic stuff you need. We are not playing your normative D&D where you don't need to keep track of whether or not you have rations and water skins, candles, rope, etc., needle and thread, whatever. Like, there's a big list of things that could be in there, and basically the 14 RPG is, we don't care about that. If you want to note you have specific supplies to flesh out your pocket lint, to do role-playing stuff, you can do that. Otherwise, the rules don't care if you have basic living supplies on you. If you are, like, adventuring in the wilderness and go, oh, let me throw a rope to that guy and pull him up a cliff, the game master doesn't go, do you have rope on your sheet? It goes, okay, yeah, that's we don't care about that. You have rope. Sure. We're more about the story in there. Later in the chapter, also, it does, as I mentioned, talk about that you can spend fortune to improve checks. You can use it to get benefits on dice rolls by basically, like, greasing the palms of characters. But there are several other mechanics to that. First, now, items, with a capital I, actually have rules, and they broadly fall into 3 categories, which you can see here: consumables, utility, and meals. Using an item takes the appropriate action in combat, and that's specified with primary and secondary. We'll talk more about the action economy later, because it's later in the book. Consumables are typically one-and-done items with limited use. You fire them off. Utility items have a static benefit. So long as you have a utility item and can activate it, you can get small benefits to it. And then meals are a special type of consumable. The description's cut off here, but you'll just have to take my word for it. Basically, much like an MMO, you can only benefit from one meal at a time, and its effect lasts a set duration, usually until you take a rest, but it could also be like a full day, and some of them are longer or shorter. Items, to specify kind of, how to get their cost, have a shop tier, which basically says where you can find them. So not only do you need money, you also need to find the right vendor. The shop tier is low, average, or high. Low is basically any traveling merchant or stall. If you're out in the wilderness and you find a rando in, the camp with an aetheryte, that's low. Average is, actually, well, technically it's not settlement with the aetheryte, because I just read the next line. Average is settlements with aetherites or Grand Company outposts. So the low is like traveling merchants, obviously, but also the equivalent of like guys in non-aetherited settlements between other major areas, or just random adventuring camps. High is only in major cities, and they use the example of the 3 major city-states in Eorzea. Well, 4, because we go up to Heavensward, but the Eorzean Alliance. And then the item list, which we're going to describe in the next bit, is, though, mentioned not to be exhausted, and if players know of a consumable from Final Fantasy XIV they'd like for some reason, or see a, mechanical niche that's not being fulfilled by some sort of item or consumable, they can make new items to use them. There are more notes about making sure that you're not, crossing over for that. Like, it's not fair to go to a second GM and demand they approve something that they didn't, approve in the first place. The chapter does note that normally your consumable items and your two items, I should say, those aren't consumed, but your actual mechanical item inventory does keep between scenarios. Again, kind of emphasizing that there's no reason to hoard fortune in this game. You should spend it on stuff and then pocket it for later. But also has more of those notes about playing with the same GMs and kind of, again, that sort of organized play thing I talked about, where, like, they may be expecting you to be taking characters to, like, multiple con games or something. So, you may or may not be getting your inventory carryover, depending. Because, obviously, different GMs and groups will have no idea of knowing where you picked up some of this stuff. There's also a sidebar. I forgot to put it in my script, but there's a little sidebar about trading items. Normally you can trade items out of combat, but there's a little sidebar that's like, hey, if your GM allows it, in the MMO you can't trade items during a combat scene, but that might be important to, pass your ethers onto the caster, so that's allowable. Then, item notes. There's a picture of one of the pages full of items here. So, to give you an idea of what sort of items you'll find in this RPG, we have, quite a lot of things. You've got a full range of potions, starting at regular potion healing 3 HP to 2d6 plus 6. Using an ether usually only gives you 1 MP back, but if you're on a high level, you can go up to 2. There are interesting items to, remove a variety of things. There's a fortifying brew to give you a barrier, for instance, and you can get a variety of the ailment clearing items, including the remedy, which clears any one debuff. We're asking for this in the MMO. That would be great. And additionally, if you want to use a primary action, you can spend first aid or medical kits to heal more HP. So normally quaffing a potion is secondary, as you may or may not be able to make out depending on the size of your screen. You can also get access to company-issue tonics to revive knocked-out allies, because explicitly you are knocked out, so, not Phoenix Downs. Also, there's a bunch of poisons to basically debuff enemies, because normally, you can't access the full range of Final Fantasy debuffs in the MMO classes. There's a bunch of potions to reduce various elemental damage, to buff your stats, and there are funny consumables like the sparkling wine or the fireworks, which do very minor little support things. They've found a way to make it entertaining that there are these sorts of consumables in the MMO that players know from, like, memes and stuff to actually get there. So I'm certain there is a player who's going to buy 99 bottles of Eorzean Red and shoot it at all the enemies. Now, your utility items offer other interesting passive options. You can get protections from certain creatures, you can get +1 vigilance by wearing glasses, and you can even use this to access extra minions. You can get a little mammoth to accompany you in battle, and other such things. And then meals, basically, as I said earlier, typically last either one day or until the end of the next encounter is over, but they can give you a variety of buffs to checks ahead of time, including providing, like, complete passive protection from debuffs. Also, every item has flavor text. This is the true MMO experience and is very important for RP. But yeah, everything has a like, flavor text description, which is real nice. Love that. That's perfect. Many of them are probably lifted straight from the MMO, but there's a few other things in there. Overall, to editorialize a little, I like this item list. I do like that it comes with a preamble we mentioned in the previous slide image, the previous photograph section, that if you don't see an item that you think you're going to need, you can propose it to your GM. But in general, the way these feel like is they're a pretty tactical way to approach it. Obviously, your basic consumables like ethers and potions are pretty important to the Final Fantasy type genre, and I think they are good to have in there. But some of the stuff like meals and like the elemental ward potions is like rewarding you for pre-prep. Just like when you do actually prog really hard content in the MMO, you get your world buffs and stuff up first. Okay, we're gonna fight, Malboro today. We gotta prepare all of our stuff, make sure we've got enough remedies, stuff like that. I also do like that, obviously, you can stash stuff like the tonics and the first aid kits, Oh, what's that? Our healer's down? Don't worry about it. Shove a tonic in his mouth, slap him some gauze. We're good. And obviously, the utility items are just as entertaining. There's goggles to make your crafting and gathering better. We'll talk more about that in a different chapter. There's small clothes, which you can equip to get protection from dying once. Basically save yourself a little bit of HP. And even cute utility items like an aetherite pendulum, where basically you can attune it to, a specific city-state type Aetheryte, and basically, if you've got a friend somewhere else, you can choose to instantly teleport to the Aetheryte closest to them. So, you can use that for party comp stuff while you're traveling. It's real cute. Now, items, again, capital I, are usually of some sort of limited use. Even utility items tend to have very specific ways they operate, and they are generally things you think of as items. There are not individual weapon and armor pieces in this RPG. That is kind of a major factor, that weapons are typically locked to specific jobs, so it would be very weird to go through all of that. And so instead of modeling a bunch of different weapon and armor prices, which are basically interchangeable, you go for whatever's, either you can afford or is best in slot for your, level. We go for it. So to model special equipment stuff, you have augmentations. These give bonuses to items you're wearing and should typically last the whole adventure sequence. They do need to be re-upped between scenarios. This is usually part of your fortune reset when you go, I set my fortune to 0. I don't carry over my starting fortune. You also reset your augmentations. You do lose your augmentation if you switch jobs because you're swapping equipment. I don't think it explicitly says this. Personally, as your GM, I would keep a note that you had the augmentation on the other job if you switch back. But you don't keep them directly between switch jobs because, again, you are switching gear. You can only benefit from one augmentation at a time. But these give you the sort of minor enchantments you'd expect from, like, D&D magic items. You can get a variety of small passive buffs, such as increasing your starting MP a little bit, getting your lower of your magic defense or defense buffed, etc. But also, some of them can add some unique abilities. This can be used to, shore up some weaknesses if you don't have, because elemental weaknesses can actually matter for mechanics in this context, it is an RPG, you might not have a black mage, which means you can't necessarily just always cast something ice aspected, because there's no Shiva Eggy, or other, elemental effects. If your party lacks healers, you can get a cure cast focus so that at least one of you can always cast a basic curing spell, sort of a thing. They also have some other options, like you can use them to give a parry to a DPS so they can do defensive stuff as well. It's all really interesting. Again, if you want me to editorialize a little, I would probably house rule that you can, if you get fortune at the end of an adventure, which you should probably be giving a little bit of fortune at the end of the scenario as just to model the cash rewards. Especially if you're in those earlier levels when the job is usually much more doing odd jobs for your grand company than doing it because you're a cool hero guy. You're a good boy who never stops. But basically have the players, pay out of their stuff to re-up their augmentations without making them worry about, their inventory stuff. But all in all, while there's only a few of them here, it's a very elegant system that I do really like, and just... I love the idea that you can get you can see it on the screen right here, for instance. You can just be like, oh yeah, I've got a flame cast focus shield or spear. I can just cast, fire 1 if I need to. And this can really help. Hey, remember how I said monks don't have ranged attacks? Get some fire gauntlets, shoot fireballs. And of course, it's Final Fantasy XIV. You can summon mounts and minions. Most of them do nothing, but some might have specific benefits. This does, by the way, include modeling the Mammoth minion you can get as the combat Mammoth item. So hypothetically, you could use minions as a stand-in for pets. If there is a minion that is a little guy who would do some combat stuff, you could apply the pet rules to this. The Wayward Hatchling minion, for instance, you can see there, you can't see its effect, but it gives your Chocobo companion +3 max HP. So, there's some mechanical interactions you can go with. Mounts, on the other hand, are effectively adventuring supplies. By level 30, you should have a basic, Grand Company Chocobo. But they do have a couple of fun examples of these sort of, standard, 0-point mounts. You can ride an Ahriman or a Behemoth if you want. Sure, that can be fun. And obviously we're setting up that these can be rewards in certain adventures. But some mounts do actually have mechanical abilities. The example they have, they're both the same mechanically, but they are different. They have Grand Company Warsteed, and they also have Allagan Node. Both of these mounts basically just say that while you have your mount out, you can't be surprised in a combat, which we will talk about very soon. But yes, there are rules for mounts and minions. Some of that will tie back into the companion rules later. That's the end of Chapter 7, which is our next one. But all in all, it is another thing you can collect, and like I said, if your GM wants to be a little flexible, you can come up with some solutions to make players' preferred minions more interesting. Chapter 7, Encounters, is another big chapter, because this is the real breakdown of the combat mechanics, which is a large bulk of stuff you need to know. I think it's pretty fair that if you're decently experienced with RPGs, you can probably fudge the, in-between, non-combat stuff role-playing of just oh, well, that guy doesn't want to talk to you, I guess, roll strength to intimidate him. I don't know, that kind of stuff. You can figure that out, see what's up. But combat is pretty detailed, especially because, as you may have picked up from my descriptions of the jobs, it can be pretty in-depth, so we will need to explain some stuff. In this chapter, we talk about how we handle starting an encounter, which includes subjects of surprise, positioning, etc., actually breaking down both rounds and then the overall action turns, like how the round is set up, the period of time in which everybody takes a single turn, what you do on your turn, what actions you can take, and a lot of rulings and other discussions about how those work. We also dissect abilities completely, how to read them, so how to resolve them, and all those other things, What does it mean when it says target? What does it mean when it says, area, range, etc.? And then we move on to advanced stuff, like markers. Yes, there are marker attacks in the tabletop RPG. We talk about limit breaks and how you use them, several sets of rules about how to handle your HP and your MP, how to handle phase transitions is another really cool thing I really like about the RPG, is that phases are part of the encounter. Doing a single encounter fate, or a one-wave fate, I should say, or, the equivalent of field encounters with mobs, even basic dungeon pull equivalents, that's probably one phase. But you could say that a fate of, waves of enemies could be multiple phases, as you have to defeat, the same guy, 3 times over or something. And obviously, boss fights can have phases. And this means that some abilities are, once per phase, they come back over multiple phases, and we reset through all that stuff. And also ends with using companions to round out your party comp. Chocobos are the example framework and the stat block they give you, but hypothetically, you could use this to model simple NPCs who escort you. I know that there are sections in the later half, which isn't modeled by this part of the RPG, but could be. But there's sections where, for MSQ, you will actually, take over other major characters in the Scions, and they usually have, super simplified actions they can take. Could absolutely handle companions like that, of just making them, non-player character jobs or roles that do stuff in the backdrop. We have the full list of the commonly seen buffs and debuffs that are in the game. And also, at the end, we have a battle log page, which is a sheet you can copy to keep track of all the stuff going on in a fight. And throughout the rest of our discussion of this chapter, we're going to break down a lot of that stuff, but that's your high-level overview of what's in this chapter for you to get at, which is indeed a lot of stuff. So, breaking down your combat encounters, you have pretty typical stuff. To begin the encounter, you determine who is surprised. If you are surprised, you just skip your first turn. And it does note that you can have characters on different sides be surprised. So you might surprise enemies, or only surprise some of them, or only some of the PCs may be surprised. But then you have to determine placement. Normally, when you're setting up the map, you should have the baby jail like you do when you start a duty in 14. So players can place themselves, or the GM might give them fixed positions. This would be very likely very common if you're being surprised. And we go on through all that. And then, once you have your placement, you determine the action order. This is determining the action order for PCs and allies. The enemy turn should be roughly preset. The pre-made material will say, who goes in what order. And if you're making your own stuff, you should pick a fixed order as GM for when enemies go. And the GM doesn't have to tell the players right away what the order is. The game often talks about how you can choose to be transparent with your players and let them know, hey, this is going to happen in this order. Or you can be you don't know, you have to make tactical decisions, based on what you see here, kind of a thing. Could be revealed at time. Once you decide the action order, you're supposed to stick to it for the rest of the fight. Obviously, depending on things, you may change that up, especially early when the players don't know what they're doing. But yeah, pretty solid. Now, there is no initiative order. Once you determine your action order, you always go with the adventurer step first, where all the PCs and allied NPCs resolve. Each of them takes their turns inside the round and figure all that stuff out. Then comes the enemy step, Enemies, all of them present in the fight, take all of their appropriate turns, do all their stuff, move on. If the combat's not over by the end of the enemy step, we have the end step. This is where we do cleanup, certain things proc or go away in the end step, and also the GM gets to decide if the encounter is over. For instance, the encounter automatically ends if at the end of the enemy step there's no other enemies in it, assuming that didn't trigger a phase change right away. But generally, if you defeat all the enemies and the enemy step goes by and they're all gone, it's it's definitely over. But in the end step, if it's not over, the GM might go, okay, well, so the enemies aren't all dead, but you have, sprinted to the end of the dungeon and closed the door behind them so they can't get at you, so yeah, we're good now, kind of a thing. And it does mention that you can clear encounters without all enemies being defeated. So there are ways to solve things besides just beating everybody up, which obviously is pretty normal, but not always explicit in tabletop RPGs, but is a bit of a shake-up from the MMO. Now, on your turn, you have a primary action and a secondary action, and you can either perform your standard movement, which is not an action, or you can focus. I will discuss what you do with all those actions in the next bit of the video, the next slide in our sequence, which we will go to right now. Alright, let's recap. So, on your turn, you have your primary action, your secondary action, and you can perform your standard movement or focus. I know, we're reiterating what I just said, but it's important for the structure of this slide. Now, primary action lets you use any ability or item that is tagged primary, lets you declare you are sprinting, which specifically doubles your speed for the round. So it is a primary action to declare you're sprinting, but it is mostly just for affecting your speed stat. Or you can use your primary to perform a secondary action. With a secondary action, you can use an item or ability tagged secondary, and that's about it. And I did not see a note that said you can't perform the same secondary action multiple times. So I think if you're allowed to, because obviously items are consumable, so you only have so many in stock, and several abilities say they can only be done once per turn, or they use charges, or they're only once per phase, etc. But I think you can use your primary to do the same secondary twice, unless there was a line somewhere that just says you can't do the same action, the same titled action, more than once per turn that I missed. I did read this book kind of cover to cover, but I was, jumping back and forth while taking notes. So if there is such an alert, it's not like a very obvious bolded line. See, this is why when I write homebrew RPGs, I literally will embold or I will change text to be in red face. They should do that more, to just be like, hey, read this is important. Anyway, if you're performing your standard movement, you can move up to your speed in squares. Diagonals do all count as one, and you can break it up. If you are using your standard movement, you can say, move 2, do some actions, move 1. You can't move through enemy squares unless they're smaller than you, but you can't normally move through those up there. And if you don't want to move, you can focus. I want to say focus M, but that joke has already been dated by the time I finished the script. I'm pretty sure it's like a month old by the time I'm saying it here, but it's in my notes, so I'm going to stick to mentioning it and seeing if people remember. Anyway, you can also focus to perform a secondary action again. So, hypothetically, you can perform 3 secondary actions on the same turn so long as you don't move. And so long as I said, if you are performing the same action over and over again, you can pay the costs. For instance, if you did this, I think you could hypothetically, as White Mage, cast, regen on, 3 different guys. But that still costs MP, so. Also, I could be talking about I have not memorized the job, so I think regen was a secondary ability. Because I know Aero's a secondary, but regen could be a primary. You get what I'm getting at, though, chat. And if you want to fact-check that thing about whether or not you can perform this exact same action multiple times in a turn, you'll have to buy the book and fact-check me. Anyway, this chapter and the section of the chapter we're talking about with actions does also discuss how to use free actions. There are certain actions which are free, which you can do anytime based on certain things going on there. How instant actions work, which is every job has access to certain instant actions which can be done anytime, including not on your turn, so long as the trigger condition of that instant action is met. For instance, Provoke is an instant action for tanks that you can do once per phase, I believe, which gives you enmity when another person starts their turn. So if an enemy starts their turn and you have not managed to get them enmity, you go, oh, that guy doesn't have aggro, let me provoke him. and also discusses how movement abilities work. There are abilities which can cause movement that is not specifically taking your standard movement, so, it's all separate. And it does, of course, mention that some abilities you use may give you additional actions, but usually that they are going to be limited to certain contexts. For instance, I mentioned this in the description of the monk job. The monk combo primary action just gives you 3 more primary actions so long as they are monk attacks. So you can't then use those actions to use a secondary or sprint, because you can't use your added primary actions for anything other than the designated additional activities? I think I tried to say actions and activities at the same time there. Let's move on to the next bit. Now, you can see here I've assembled a bunch of different images for what else is covered in this chapter of varying hyper-important levels. And there is a load of stuff in this chapter to cover, but it's very well put together to kind of run you through everything you need to know in a combat encounter. Character size, for instance, is defined by a chart, and then the next several pages are spent kind of defining how to describe and utilize abilities, so, what's their name, how you find what action they take, defining whether or not they are physical. The challenge rating there is target's defense, magical, it's their magic defense, or unique, in which case it uses a unique challenge rating. And any of the other tags on those abilities are actually important, such as invoked or fire aspected or other things. We define how to read and describe all the formats of the cost of abilities, the targets, the range, what checks you're using for them. This is also the part in the book that explicitly defines what a critical hit is. Basically, if you roll a 20 on the d20, it's always a direct hit, regardless of the challenge rating of the test, and doubles the dice rolled on checks, both to deal damage and to heal. So you get crits both ways, which is always really nice. We do talk about how markers work, because they are an integral part of the MMO and are carried over to the tabletop RPG. It's one of the cooler and more unique mechanics, I think. There have been some cases with, D&D. Obviously, 4th edition was widely and incorrectly derided as just a video game. But, static markers are not always a common effect. And they're, like I said, pretty integral to this game. So basically, some abilities, usually enemy abilities, but there's no reason PCs couldn't have them some of the time, or environmental effects, there's an example, for instance, of a hallway with falling rocks given, will create markers which will trigger at certain times. Markers can be both static or mobile, both moving with the target and just moving in general, or not moving at all, and can work in different ways to deal damage or deals debuffs. There is advice here on how much information to share with your players about the mechanics, and basically, as I mentioned before, we have this discussion a lot in this RPG, but in some cases it's basically like, okay, you can be completely transparent with your players and let them know everything that would result from this, so that they can make more informed decisions, or you can keep some things to yourself in order to better replicate 14's mechanics, where if you're doing a dungeon for the first time and nobody knows what the boss does, you don't know what the boss does. You gotta figure it out. And by the way, when I say different types of damage to deal, yes, there are various factors, from anything to, like, you could set up an AoE tank buster, which is just, oh yeah, if anybody other than the tank takes this, they're gonna cry because they don't have an HP pool. Flat damage taken. Or you can be spread markers, where everybody inside that radius rolls dice, so if your markers overlap, if you're inside the concentric circles, you're going to take way more damage than you need to. However, stack markers are also in this, where it's basically like, this attack deals a flat amount of damage, which is evenly divided amongst everybody inside the area. So, all in all, really good work here carrying this stuff over that's pretty cool and fun, I think, to explicitly put them out there. And, like I mentioned before, the trigger time on markers also depends. Usually enemies will set up stuff like a stack or a spread or whatever, like, ahead of time. Like, they'll do it as their action on their turn and basically be like, okay, at the end of the next adventurer step, it'll go off before they take their next turn. So you have a little bit of time to react. But they can be, like, all over the place. They also completely define, as I mentioned before, the phases mechanic to let you know, basically, battles can have phases. This lets you reset certain mechanics and also cycles through some other stuff. They talk about HP and MP. The HP stuff isn't really relevant for this sort of dive, but if you're going for a deep dive, you do need to know about, like, resting and HP recovery and stuff, getting them back. Usually you recover pretty rapidly between encounters. MP, though, I think it's important to note, you recover 2 at the end of every adventure step by default. And it talks about limit breaks and more. Typically the way it works is when you're doing a big fight, your GM will say you have limit breaks, and Despite being a light party, you have 3 limit break bars, but that means you have 3 total uses for your party. So usually somebody's getting left out, but, you can make it work. The GM even, or rather the book even talks about the GM letting you use limit breaks outside of combat scenarios. For instance, could you, use your tank LB to stop a boulder, or, use your monk LB to instantly do a move and punch down a wall or something. There's the list of the defaults, the standard issue buffs and debuffs, which are named enhancements and enfeeblements. I have another whole block of those notes we're going to run down, so we'll cover that in a second. And then also, what we will talk about a little later as well, there is the description of the rules for companions. The stats given, again, are for companion chocobos, combat chocobos, but you can use the general emphasis of the rules to work through several different sources. And as I come to the end of this, I added this in an editing pass. I mentioned this a little earlier, but this was the part where I discovered it in my notes, rereading over this section. But there are a couple of notes I want to keep in here that are not strictly covered, in my previous notes, and are more kind of assumptions in the text, but I do want to highlight them while we're talking about combat encounters. One, I mentioned this before, but there's no auto-attacking. You're starting at level 30, everybody's getting more combat reliant, so, you basically always have to do an action to attack. You cannot get auto-attacks, which kind of tracks. You're doing a special button, and that's mostly what people know about, but that can, be a thing out there. I would probably homebrew a way to do, 1 damage with an auto-attack, maybe more based on your level, if it matters about HP inflation, but it's not super necessary. And the other thing I wanted to mention that I did not previously discuss, I think, in talking about jobs, but basically, almost every ability in this RPG does something automatically when you declare and target it, for both PCs and NPCs. This is why having dedicated healers and stuff is important, because you, no matter what, will be taking some damage usually, even if it's chip damage, but also goes the other way. You almost always do chip damage with attacks on enemies. Everything will have a basic effect when you choose to use it, then an additional effect for either a direct hit or an ability check trigger. So you're, like I said, almost always doing chip damage in combat, but if you roll well, or if you have good bonuses to your rolls, you will prog faster. You will work through the combat faster, which is why buffs and debuffs are important, because they can modify those numbers. But yeah, that's just a factor that, like I said, I hadn't brought up before in the script, but if you're asking, you're watching this video and you're wondering, how does this combat system work? Yeah, no, like I said, everything has a basic effect almost always, and then a direct hit effect for if you actually hit on the D20 roll. This eliminates a problem with lots of D&D inspired D20 type systems, where it is entirely possible for you to go through your turn and just fucking whiffaroni. In this case, it's no, unless you have some kind of debuff which makes you straight up miss, or enemies have some kind of countering ability, you will always do a little bit of damage. Now, as you can perceive from my summary image, there are more standardized debuffs than buffs, but that's because a lot of this is player facing, though, as I mentioned in the items chapter, there are ways for you to get some of these debuffs onto NPC enemies. So, the enhancements, the buffs, are crit up, which just reduces the number on the d20 to get critical hits by the X amount. Drain restores X amount of HP when your abilities inflict any damage, so if you don't deal damage, you don't heal, but anytime you deal damage, you heal the appropriate amount of HP. Revivify is what they call regens. You heal X HP at the end of the relevant step. Some people in the playtesting in the beginner's box did have some concerns about this. The way that its rules as written is that it's everybody gets their regen at the end of their relevant step, so enemies at the end of the enemy step, adventurers at the end of the adventurer step. This means that if you cast a regen on a PC with a full bar, you're going to miss out on some healing. That is also, however, how it works in the MMO, so I think that's intentional. If you did want to move it to just the end step, everybody regens, that may be a little more in tune with tabletop style builds, but I do think the idea is that you should not preemptively regenerate people. You shouldn't give revivifies until you're actually suffering damage, because you will be suffering damage. If everybody's HP bars are full, you should cast an offensive spell as healer, I guess, is what we're aiming for. Anyway, Transcendent is the revive invul, specifically. You cannot be harmed or debuffed until your turn starts or you use an ability. So if you use an instant ability, on trigger, it will go away, but otherwise it's when you get around to your turn, you're good. And X Ready is a buff which just sets up other abilities. Several abilities in jobs will say you can only do this when you're under the effect of X Ready. That is a kind of constant way to signify that you can do certain follow-up attacks. Now we're going to beef up speedrun. Bind reduces your speed to 0 and gives you an advantage die to be hit. Blinded, you can't see, you take -2 on all ability checks. Brink of Death is -5 to all checks, and you get weakened. Or if you get weakened, you go comatose instead. You can only remove Brink of Death by resting. Comatose is knocked out, but you need to rest the full day. So basically, between Brink of Death and comatose, you have, like, being KO'd, but you have, more story restrictions on it. DOT inflicts the listed damage at the end of the appropriate step. Death is you're dead. Enmity, specifically, gives -5 on all checks and can't... -5 on all checks with people other than the enmity target. Sorry, I was misreading my lines. They're all clumped together here. But yeah, so enmity is the provocation effect. It's not a static, like, enmity chart. It's just that enemies who have enmity get -5 on attacks and abilities against people who aren't the enmity target. So usually, if NPCs want to hit their moves, they'll try and hit the tank who gave them enmity. But they could still try and take a swipe at non-aggroed targets. It's just very likely that it's going to fail and either do only minor damage or possibly do nothing. I believe there may be some enemy abilities that don't do anything outside of a direct hit. In which case, you'd want to save those for, your enemy tanks. Heavy is your speed is halved and all hits are automatically direct. KO is KO, obviously. You're knocked out. You're not dead, but you are unconscious. Paralysis is if you roll a 5 or less on any ability check. So you roll every time you do something. If you roll 5 or less, you cancel it completely. This includes getting your limited uses or resources back. You just don't do it because you're paralyzed. Petrify is -5 on all checks, and you can't act on your turn or use instant abilities. Prone is -2 on all checks, and you have an advantage die to be hit, and you cannot move at all unless you use half your speed to stand up. So no crawling in this. Silence is you can't use invoked ability. Sleep is -3 on all abilities, and is removed when you take damage or if an ally spends a primary action to wake you. I do note that sleep doesn't seem to say that it explicitly prevents actions. It's just that you narratively are asleep, and you take -3s. Slowed is you get half speed and -2 on your abilities. Stun means no actions or instants, removes all markers you did, adds an advantage die to be hit, -5 on all ability checks, and also only goes away when indicated. You can't Asuna stun, but you can only explicitly ever be stunned once per encounter, unless otherwise stated. So stun is great for interrupts and other abilities. You can only stun a given enemy or target once per encounter, doesn't say once per phase, and also means that player characters can only be stunned the one time. And weakness is -2 on all checks and also can turn into Brink of Death. That's it. That's enhancements and a few ones. And to round out encounters, the companion rules are at the very back here, and so, like the MMO, you can have a companion to round out your roles. Companions are basically all formats of special NPCs controlled by players that are, I guess you would say, controlled by the group, rather than specifically a pet tied to a particular class. The examples in the book are combat chocobos, who are level synced to you, obviously, and they do have all their stats there. You can see kind of the cut in from this slide. And the way this is intended to work is that it's supposed to be so that if you have less than 4 people, you can use them to fill out roles you don't have to make a light party, but also you could hypothetically still use these for, like, let's say, if you wanted a party of 4 healers, never mind that Sage isn't out yet, and need a tank, and going on so forth from there. The section does note that official scenarios are balanced for a light party, so using companions instead of using another player character might make it more difficult, but that's just something to keep in mind. And like I said, they are synced to the ability or the level of your players. They have various abilities they can use, which are listed in their appropriate leveled stat block. You can see an example here. The Defender Chocobo has access to Choco Strike and Choco Drop at level 40, which is dead center of the image there. So it can either deal, 2 damage in a 5x5, or 5 damage to 2 enemies 1 square away, and inflict enmity on the appropriate targets. Note that these are all just basic abilities. There's no direct hits here. It just passively does some extra damage. And they have the same action economy, as player characters. So they can only do, X number of abilities. And their choice of abilities is going to be much more limited than a PC. Again, you can look at it and see, even at level 40, all of the player character tanks have way more options than just 2 moves. But it's a thing you can do to round out and could be used, for instance, if you were a GM trying to balance out larger encounters without having more players. Still, very neat. But that's going to leave us out of the combat chapter. Hopefully that gave you enough of a general idea of what you're getting into the combat. Now, Chapter 8 Adventuring is pretty short, but it covers a lot of useful basics for non-combat stuff. Obviously, combat encounters is very long because that is a bulk of your complexity, but there's some simpler stuff as well. It has a brief page on intro to role-playing, if you've only ever played the MMO and cringe at RP servers, or just need some advice in general. It has a longer section on when to make checks outside of combat. It has the methodology of saying what options are available and setting the challenge rating, when to make multiple checks, when the GM should award advantage dice to these sorts of things, etc., etc. Pretty normal stuff that players should be aware of and GMs should know about as well to kind of set their own tone. When I mean methodology also, it basically says that, you can go for you have a discrete bulleted list of options for what core attribute you roll, or you could just suggest options, or you can be fully freeform. For a game like this, I would probably say, since there's only so many dice to roll anyway, I would probably have 1 or 2 preferred options with the challenge rating set, and then, open it up to players to be like, well, hold on, maybe I could do something with this. We also spent some time talking about time, how Hydaelyn, because we're still in Heavensward, we don't say Aetheris yet, has 24 hours, which are colloquially called bells, and, talking through different periods of that. There's also a section which basically says when you're not in structured time, assume everything you do takes 1 bell per action. There's an example in the book I will briefly regurgitate here. / spectacles. So basically the way they give it is, if you've got a delivery quest where you need to do some stuff in Ul'dah, it would basically take you 2 bells, aka 2 in-game hours, to do. One is to receive the item you need to deliver, the other is to deliver it. But this is accounting for, all the different things you have to do first. And this does allow you to take into account, your resting periods, which we'll talk about next, because that's the next page, is that block. There is also discussions of travel and how long that can go, including talking about teleporting, delegating to others, or if certain actions may take more time. There is also then, as I said, next a brief passage on resting and sleeping. Basically, resting is a single action you can take that should, keep up your basic needs, make sure your items are in repair, and some stuff, can only be used rest or are reset on a rest. And then sleeping very specifically takes 6 bells. You need 6 hours to get a good night's of sleep in Final Fantasy XIV. And you do have requirements in order for you to sleep, but if you do sleep, you should get a big resting bonus and basically, refresh yourself to full and have a day pass for anything that matters for that. There is also a sidebar about being sleep deprived if you're pressing yourself. So Chapter 9, Playing the Game, is another pretty simple chapter, but I think a very fundamental one. It's basically how to go about actually having a session of the Final Fantasy XIV tabletop RPG. It discusses a lot of practical advice on scheduling, how much time to commit, how to decide who's playing what, the kind of stuff you actually work out at a game table. It is important. Real solid basic advice that I think games like D&D sometimes struggle to discuss. I know every edition of D&D for years has these kinds of sections, but I really feel like, again, hey, you're gonna need to commit 4 or 5 hours to this if you're doing it right. You can do shorter, but then you're gonna have to deal with taking shorter periods and stuff. Here's how you, leave off in the middle of a session and shit like that. And honestly, it means that I think this section probably could be earlier in the book, but readers are probably, looking for flashier stuff like their job buttons and fighting monsters and stuff. This is interesting, I will say, though. This is all soapbox little. This section does contain, first of all, a sidebar about how you can't rely on fan-made rules summaries, which I have to say, this is post-COVID, guys. You have to make some allowances for virtual tabletop. It's a little weird. There are genuinely some backwards stuff about the weaknesses of playing online like talking about how, oh, you're at the mercy of whatever map program you're on, and you're all that. And it's like, I don't get it. Like, if you're playing online, you're doing it probably because that's the only way you can do it. You have friends from all over. Like, again, I don't know if this was, a thing designed in, like, the JP side for, like, convention play at FanFests or something, but you're the official tabletop RPG, licensed and everything, of an MMO. The whole point of the MMO is that people, like, get together and play across the world. My free company's full of people from all over the place geographically. If we were trying to do, like, a LAN party all in one place, we couldn't play. It's the same for if we wanted to play the tabletop version. So, I don't know. It's really weird for them to discuss this. Like, what industry plant did they hire to write this part? And I know there's some complex relationships with, like, digital products for, like, the PDF and stuff. There's some, business leverage to be had there with, like, brick and mortar friendly local gaming store, who may or may not actually be that friendly, depending, if you're lucky. So, obviously, like, I do know that companies have to think about these things in terms of, like, the physical inventory, but that's no reason not to have virtual supplements. And I don't know, this is one of those things that, Gabe Newell of Steam says, piracy is a service problem. It's like, well, if you don't want potentially inaccurate fan summaries on the internet, you should sell them your product. If you don't want people to, rip and scan your book, you should sell it virtually as a PDF. There's infrastructure for that. There's quite a lot of infrastructure for that. Been a user of drive-thru-RPG for many, 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 many years. So, I don't know. It's, other than that kind of stuff that obviously as I'm making to you a internet video on YouTube from my channel where I post recorded virtual tabletop sessions and have been doing so for at least as long as the channel's been around. So, like, 10 plus years. Like I said, I don't like the read. It's not enough to discourage me off the product, but, like, if you put me in a room with the tabletop team, I'd have to call them out on it. Other than that, though, other than the weird bias against online gaming, again, very weird, you're an MMO, get over yourself. The advice in this section, though, is really good. It discusses how to pick scenarios and that sort of thing, the advantages of going pre-written versus tailor-made by your GM, like actually discussing the theory there. Which, again, I don't think... The 14 Tabletop's in a really interesting place where it has some pre-made scenarios both in the book and in other books and, like, the starter adventure and stuff, and they may have released some smaller booklets or could release smaller booklets later, where they're going to have these kinds of pre-made, pre-written circumstances, but also have the opportunity for creativity. I feel like, I haven't read the latest Dungeon Master's Guide, like the one they put out a couple of years ago now, year ago. Seemed very solid and had a lot of good advice. Like, they went out of their way to make that better. But I don't know if they have a frank discussion about, like, buying Wizards of the Coast scenarios versus writing your own scenarios. Because, I don't know, that feels like a little too on the nose for Wizards to actually talk about that you shouldn't buy more product. But, like I said, the authors of the latest DMG seem to have their heads on straight about that kind of stuff. That wasn't, written with Hasbro corporate breathing over their back. But yeah, like, this is all really good. There's a valuable section on Session 1, some might even say Session 0, what you do on the first session, how you develop that kind of stuff, and includes a discussion about developing relationships between PCs, including real quick, like, if you just show up with some people who, like, are finishing their character sheets at the table and you have no idea. There's a D20 chart. I could make a pickup shot, and I talked about throwing it in here, but I don't think I will for sake of pacing. You can just take my word for it. There's a random D20 chart. The next bit of the chapter is basically in two halves, and it's on GM and player roles. They discuss that players have it relatively simple, but it does encourage you to stay active and involved for purposes of role-playing, making checks, and in encounters, staying on the ball, because even when it's not your turn, you never know when you're going to need to proc an instant ability. It is a turn-based game where there's so many actions per round, but much like the MMO, you do have to be aware of when you're doing things, off cooldown, as it were. More telling, though, is a very well-written and very genuine sidebar about player boundaries and how to check in with people when they aren't clicking. This is, like, super important, something, I've struggled with different groups and games, people not being involved all the time, so, like, it's a really good way to, like, discuss that. That said, the GM section has some great advice in, again, a general manner. Asking PCs for input, powering through mistakes, when to improv or change rules for your group, remembering always to ask your players to reconsider if they do something crazy which is out of the bounds of the game. Like, there are reputations of problem players in these stories on the internet of people who just do wacky off-the-wall stuff, and, like, the book's genuine recommendation is, like, if you're gonna do something goofy, like, you know, kick an important NPC off a cliff, or, you know, I'll defect to Garlemald. It's like, you could just be like, don't do that. The scenario's not written for that. Or I didn't write for that. Worry about that, like, when we're at a choice point I'm prepared for, kind of a thing. It also talks about how to handle stuff that might be expected from the MMO, like link pearls, instant communication, and teleportation, instant travel, and has a very large sidebar on what to do if your party wipes. If they fuck up an encounter or you overtuned it, what do you do? They include, you know, various forms of advice, like maybe the story can progress, but you do a different thing. Maybe you get bailed out at the last second. Maybe you get captured. And outright recommending, hey, if they get bounced in, like, the climactic fight, you can turn to them and ask, hey, you want to try that again? You want to try that again from the top? The pull quote at the front, I should also say... Actually, no, wait, that's the next line of my note. I was going to say this, because this was the thing I talked about, how to work out time in your battles. The next line in my script is talking about quick saving. When you're in the middle of an encounter, and, like, you'd like to call it a day, because, you know, timing is very important, the best advice is to wait, obviously, for certain points, but, you know, you just note the middle of the encounter. You take notes of the maps where everybody's health and stuff is. It's all real great, and can be a boon to your ability to schedule. And the GM advice at the end that's really good, like, they have several sections, but the most important, I think, is basically, like, have confidence. You know, you're the GM, you can make it work. Like, if you don't know what you're doing, you can ask players for input on some stuff. You know, you're not sure how to respond, or, you know, you're like, we've got some downtime, what do you guys want to do, kind of a thing. But most importantly, it's just like, no, you're running the game, you know, whatever you say goes, figure it out. And like I said, it's a really interesting thing to talk about all this GM power of, like, hey, you're the game master. We don't recommend altering the rules willy-nilly, but if you want to change some stuff to fit your group better, you know, work out this, work on it, you can do this, that, and the other thing here and there, all sorts of stuff like that. And then versus, like, but don't be careful trusting internet people. It's a little odd, like I said. Now, the actual thing I was going to talk about, sorry, because I skipped a line just by the way, there's a line break there in the script. The pull quote on the front page, which you can see in this image, is lifted straight from the LoadSun website, but it basically describes every single thing you can do for EXP in 14. So, you know, quests, instant dungeons, guild tests, all that stuff, leaves, etc. Like, it's not perfectly modeled in the tabletop, but it works great for inspiration to just open this page up and see this example of all the different things you can do in this system. Sorry, this image is blurrier than ever. Anyway, the Downtime chapter. It's number 10. This one is also not super long, but it is important because it covers, well, downtime. This primarily takes the form of personal quests, which are the things that you do in downtime to get some extra fortune and gather other positive stuff. The chapter starts by discussing when you have time for them, which can be before, after, or between sessions even, to kind of form a setup, as the structure of the scenario allows, basically pitching you different ideas. Usually you don't do them in the middle of the session because you'll probably be, like, on a scenario. But, you know, there's rooms and stuff in there. This includes rules for crafters and gatherers, an important part of the MMO. We'll cover that in a separate slide because there's charts, so we'll circle back to that. There's also 6 miscellaneous personal quests, so that if you don't know what to do when it's downtime, you know, say you finish a scenario like 2 hours into a 4-hour evening and you're like, okay, what do we do now? And it's like, well, we'll do personal quests. If you don't know what you want to do, you can randomize with a d6. Miscellaneous personal quests just model a whole bunch of MMO stuff. You can seek fortune to get money for your next scenario, which is probably like treasure maps, playing the market board, a whole bunch of other stuff. You can accompany other adventurers on missed quests, basically simulating your daily roulettes. You can basically participate in PvP. It's a large-scale battle against adventurers and basically includes a battle pass for mounts. It has a checklist for, you know, how many of these downtime PvP battles you have, these mass battles you've successfully fulfilled, and if you do, you win a mount. You can challenge NPCs to mini-games, including possibly playing them against the GM. It gives you rules to just roll them, but also is like straight up like, hey, if you actually have Triple Triad, you can just play Triple Triad or Mahjong or something. Give me that playable Queen's Blood. You can do tasks for your various guilds, you know, probably kind of doing like guild leaves and other stuff. Or one of your options is you can always just relax at home for a max HP bonus. Basically, the beauty of interior decorating. It's very funny and lighthearted, but also very true to tone, much like how there's that one section that started with just, by the way, glamour is real. So, the crafting and gathering sections. Also, I should apologize to you. I'm doing a take 2 after I literally read all my notes on this, and forgot to turn my mic on, so if my delivery sounds a little flatter, it's because it's hard to recreate the first time. Anyway, crafting and gathering is really cool, though. I'll try to keep that enthusiasm up. You have several unique tables. I'm only showing you kind of a sampler here of, like, a couple of them. But the functional way you get results for your crafting and gathering personal quests is you roll a d20 plus your adventuring rank. What's your adventuring rank? So the way that works is you start at 1 in each Disciple of Land or Hand. All of them are included in the game, because most of them are kind of similar. When you finish a quest successfully, you complete your quest, you roll 1d6. If it's higher than your current rank, you go up +1. Currently, that means you can only go up to 6 in adventuring rank, explicitly not, leveling. But they could improve this later if they needed to. +6 is pretty good. I don't know what the bonuses for stats are going to get like if they, go all the way to like an Endwalker or Dawn Trail source book. I don't know how that's going to look, but +6 is pretty good. Now to what they actually do, Botanist and Miner can gather catalysts and materials, which make crafting easier various ways. If you get catalysts, they give you advantage dice, and if you get good materials, they give you a flat bonus to the roll, so, you can craft better. Fisher is semi-unique in that, actually, it's pretty unique. There's exactly one chart for Fisher, but what it does is it lets you sell fish for fortune, but it has a title side quest. It has a fucking MMO achievement built into it, where if you get the high level on a row, you can unlock a title, and if you equip that title, you get a unique ability, and unique interrupt action, which lets you yoinky splinky small creatures within 3 spaces, like pull them towards you. This does remove their markers, by the way. It's forced movement, so that's so funny. I love it so much that there's a achievement with a title which does a thing, like, built in. That's so cute. Now, for the most part, crafters, Disciple of Hand, are basically all the same, functioning all the same, with 2 exceptions. Alchemists get some extra rules because they get to make consumables, so they have 2 separate charts, basically. One is the ability to produce anything tagged consumable, and the second is that they can enhance potions and ethers you already have to higher tiers, which is nice. Culinarians can produce meals for meal bonuses, natch. Everybody else is used to augment gear. Based on how high you roll, you can select augments of a certain price level without actually paying for them. And all in all, I want to say, this is the part I was really passionate about, this section's really great because it kind of explores how your campaign's going to go and like how long-term play works. It's been discussed in earlier chapters that the default assumption is that between scenarios, your fortune resets to kind of whatever the minimum is for your current adventuring level, and your augmentations go away. Your items that you've bought stay, assuming you're not, like, hopping GMs and like, organized play and shit. But typically they should stay, and kind of go on, out there. But when you use downtime, that means you can use your particular focus to massage those effects and set up for the next adventure. You can go, okay, so, like, say we're level 40, we reset to whatever our default fortune is, which is, like, the 3 or 4, I think? At that level, and you go, okay, we're gonna need some more money for the thing. I'm gonna, go gamble at the gold saucer and try and win big. We're gonna go play Slices Right and see. Or you can go, oh, I really liked that augmentation I had in the last scenario. Let me spend some time as, an armorer or a weaver or something and make it again. Now, kind of like in the MMO, but a little different. Becoming an Omnicrafter is hard because you have to finish quests as those classes and keep doing them to get the numbers up. But it can encourage a group of PCs to specialize in 1 or 2 things to get their due diligence in. And while it does talk about, where downtime goes, you can still downtime in the middle of a scenario if downtime's built in. If there's a reason in the scenario for there to be like, you guys run a dungeon and then narratively, you go to sleep or a day passes or, you're waiting for a thing to happen and it's not just like the next, quest marker procking or something. You can take downtime. You can, say you blow all your fortune earlier, adding advantage dice to social checks or something, or otherwise, like, bought a shitload of ethers you haven't used yet, but then you find out halfway through the scenario through, like, research and role-playing that, like, oh no, we're gonna have to fight a boss now that's, like, gonna try and paralyze us all. Let's stock up on paralytics, but I'm broke. Let me go play Mahjong until I get enough points, enough gil for it, kind of a thing. It's very nice. I really like it because it adds a lot of role-playing flavor. It's true to the MMO, but in a fun way. And so we are now at Chapter 11, The Lands of Eorzea. It is a longer chapter, but I can summarize it relatively fast despite it is honest importance. Because you can see in the image here with the chapter header, most of the actual text is just lifted from the Encyclopedia Eorzea. So it is from the lore books they've already published. But if you're not familiar with the MMO or you need a refresher, this is a great look at Eorzea specifically, with detailed sections on the 4 main city-states, Limsa, Ishgard, Gridania, Ul'dah. It includes descriptions of their major internal factions and guilds, names of major NPCs in a big list, which is great for verisimilitude all around. You don't have to go, what's that guy's name? You go, yes, you need to speak to this guildmaster. Now, I, as a player, don't remember what the fuck the fishing guildmaster is called, but this book has a name right there. And I'm not looking it up to keep the point, but I could look it up in the book. And it also includes maps that are all lifted straight from the MMO, but with labels, so it's important. This also includes labeled maps for the field zones outside of cities, and good stuff for basic geography and scenario building, letting you know where things are. And it ends with a small discussion of Alamigo, which will probably be in the Stormblood book, and a breakdown of Idleshire, which is technically neutral, but is part of it all. So yeah, I can summarize what's in it super fast. It is a very important chapter if you are a game master world building, or you're a player who needs to look something up because you don't remember what the head of the Leather Workers Guild is called, do you, chat? Let me know in the comments if you do. And I will know psychically if you looked it up through the power of my echo. The big crystal will tell me. So, yeah, it's very useful, but it's easy to summarize because it's a big section recapping lots of geography and stuff. And so we come to what will be our final chapter, but not our final slide. Scenarios, number 12. So, the primary concern with the structure of this chapter is how to use pre-written material and how to read and understand them. The writing and structural stuff is much more in the Game Master's Guide. That actually has, steps of, here's a rough outline you can use for your scenarios to write and how you would structure them, and kind of, uses some example scenarios, but is actually much more about building. The core book here just includes a basic and general breakdown of the structure of things like events, how to identify the way they're written, as in how to read, the parts that a GM should read out loud, what notes you should show your players, what is, stuff for you, etc. They explain that when you're looking at a pre-made scenario, it should include, complete selection of enemy tokens, maps, and encounter tactics. And yes, basically, they have statements on how enemy AI should function. And it has a section on how to read NPC stat blocks specifically because they are similar to PC blocks, but are a lot more compact, obviously, and usually individual enemies have way less options than players do, except bosses, which can have, multiple big sections. And then this chapter includes 3 pre-made scenarios, labeled number 4, 5, and 6. I assume 1, 2, and 3 were in the beginner box. And these are for level 30, level 40, and level 50, respectively, complete with the beautifully illustrated, fully detailed maps, tokens, etc. I would actually show you the maps, tokens, and stuff from these scenarios, but I'm probably going to run, at least one of these as a tester, if not more, and that'll probably go up on the channel. So, we'll save spoilers for my future players and stuff, and you can see some of them in effect, hopefully, at a later date. The book also includes 4 pre-made characters. I think it's the same ones that were in the starter set. You've got Warrior, White Mage, Dragoon, and Black Mage at the appropriate, levels to figure out their stuff and what stats are appropriate. Also, real quick, in this section of the book, there's the sheet for Chronicle Adventure, loosely pictured here, and the explanations for how they work. So it, talks about your objectives, places of people interest, outcomes of your stuff, various other notes you may want to take, stuff like that. And it says that you should record the dates of the sessions, use IRL dates if it's better than tracking in-game dates. You should jot down all the names, jobs, and descriptions of the party members, and like I said, the, actual objectives of the scenario and how the people are in there. Just a good way to keep all your notes and keep track of what you have been doing, in addition to any pausing you may do. And on page 301 specifically, there is the rules summary. It covers summarizing your basic checks and challenge rating, how advantage dice and penalties work, a summary of encounters, actions, phases, and ability checks, and a reminder about limit breaks. It's just a really good page to know which page it is, and which one to shuffle through. And from pages 308 to 311, we have the FAQ, Frequently Asked Questions. It's got several categories of basic questions. It's always good to handle questions like this. And so you've got general questions, movement questions, buff and debuff questions, abilities, etc., etc. I'm obviously not going to replicate everything here, but here's a sampler you can see in the image. And yeah, if you have the book, there is an FAQ in the back. A great feature to have. I'll get a little on my horse again and say it's also good to have, frequently asked questions as a online source you can look up anywhere. But the fact that they are already in the book and printed is also, nice. And so, after the FAQ, the book has sections for corrections and errata to the starter set, if you have one of those, and then has a bunch of pages which are markers, templates, and enemy icons to copy for the scenarios, and also just in general, and when combined with the maps from the scenarios chapter earlier, basically gives you everything you need to run them, which is great, and also just is good stuff to work with. Like I said, it's got the pages you'd need to scan, photograph, or print otherwise for, stack markers, spread markers, all that kind of stuff. We also, at this section, have a blank character sheet, the index, which seems like a perfectly functional index, and the credits. And thus, after almost 40 slides, we have reviewed this book cover to cover. I've posted some pictures of the sections, some pictures better than others, and kind of broken down this thing front to back. The result overall, since this is closing thoughts, is a very neat-seeming game. It has a heavy emphasis on the tactical, as you would expect being so closely based on Final Fantasy XIV, an MMO, which is about, timing and positioning. And that said, it still leaves plenty of room for RP and for unique touches to alter those mechanics. The core book doesn't have a lot of examples of it, but does lay out the framework for all you would need to customize from that. You can absolutely use titles, augmentations, scenario rewards, mounts, minions, companions, whatever, to, customize your characters. So you don't necessarily have to, completely homebrew apart a character if you want to change their, job and class actions. You could just add on top of what's already there. It has all the tools you need to play a much more character and RP-heavy game, in between very detailed encounters, though those encounters can also be very casual if that's your sort of play. It has a decent way of handling downtime. I think the downtime chapter and actions are pretty useful and flexible. It does a pretty good job of abstracting economy, honestly, thank God. Compressing all your currency tab into one stat for fortune is really good, rather than chasing down individual guild prices of everything. And in combat, you will not likely feel useless with both the ability that most... Sorry, I should rephrase that, because abilities is what they are called. With the process where using an ability almost always has a basic effect that always procs, and then has a direct hit effect, or otherwise, semi-critical effect, and then an actual crit effect. You've got a chance to do anything from just chip damage to actually, one-shotting mobs and stuff. So that has that kind of emphasis over some games like even the current edition of D&D, there's some stuff you can do if you miss with, the current edition if you have the right weapon traits, but, usually it's a bobbled roll to bobbled roll. I'm not an expert on Pathfinder 2E. I think mostly you still just have to worry, a failure is a failure kind of a thing. Usually it's just their action economy is a lot looser, and they have more variance in, DC, dice levels, so your checks tend to be more consequential overall, because sometimes you really fail when you fail, and sometimes you really succeed when you succeed. So it's not like you roll a d20, roll low, nothing happens. It's, you can fuck your stuff up, which works to, I think, what Pathfinder's going for as well. But if you are concerned about kind of the common D&D lament of, I roll a d20, I get one roll of a d20 every turn and I don't do anything, this is better about that. I will say, the rule set is probably going to be a little weird if you don't cleave to the 4-man light party, but it does have the tools to work around that, both lower down party members and upper, if you wanted to, because that would mean you'd need 9 people with a GM, but if you wanted to go to a 8-man full party, you could probably make it work. The jobs are built to be really interesting. I think they're built really well. Like I said, I could do entire videos theory crafting, like, what your... theory crafting your optimal tabletop rotations and shit like that is. Like, I think they all have a strong sense of tactics with a good sense of flow, but also are not going to be literally doing the same buttons over and over again, because the tabletop mechanics are just different enough from the MMO that, like, there's a few different tricks you can do with the way the action economy is set up. I have some concerns about future-proofing. We're really going to have to see how the Stormblood books work, and I know that we're probably still, like, maybe, 6 months-ish from the next X-Pack, which is supposed to, like, revamp jobs a lot. So it's going to be interesting if, like, all of the jobs are, like, frozen at their, Dawn Trail .0 time period going forward with these books. Maybe that's what the next X-Pack, text, the Splat book will be. We'll be just revamping all the job options if they change them a lot. But the core mechanics should be simple enough that you can get people who only play D&D to bite. It still uses just a D20 and some D6s. It has all the hallmarks you'd like if you like 14. And you're like, oh, I've heard about this tabletop thing, I want to give it a try. I know that there are a decent number of 14 creators who are also tabletop creators. So you've got something similar to the MMO, but unbound from the constraints of the code. And all in all, I can't wait to try it out, and hopefully add some practical knowledge along with this reading of it. I think you should probably check out our podcast, but, maybe we'll do a separate video. Obviously, also, hopefully, actual plays will be recorded so you can check them out. But wait, there's more! So in addition to that obvious plug to stay tuned for some actual play, some recordings of the game, hint, hint, subscribe, I also do have the Game Master's Guide. I didn't have it when I started structuring this video, so while I referenced it, it wasn't part of the full conversation. While I probably won't do a cover-to-cover review of it like this video, I might do a summary because it adds even more stuff that you would expect. It includes more GM advice, which has advice on writing encounter scenario and more, like just basic story structure and stuff. It includes new rewards as well for all of that. It has rules for exploration events and skill challenges, so kind of giving you non-combat stuff to do that can be more engaging. New rules for weather effects in encounters, so yeah, the weather does actually matter in the tabletop if you want it to. Object rules for, like, interactables. It also includes a bunch of new personal quests for Downtime, including if you wanted to try out Restoration, Allied Societies, info events, and seasonal events. It's great. It has a heap of pre-made scenarios as well, even more encounters in them, and does end with a bestiary full of enemy stat blocks all the way up to the 60s. So, great variety of things for you to pull from for this sort of stuff. In addition to the Game Master's Guide, a shorter review video, if we get a lot of response from this video, since I'm not seeing a lot of content for the 14 RPG, we could do some job guides for the TTRPG also. They have some very intricate tactics that I find very interesting, and that is the game design stuff I eat up with. Some of my favorite homebrew stuff that I have done is design, classes and jobs with those kinds of cool mechanical progressions. So we'll take a gander at that. So this is the actual outro slide. I'm here reminding you to feed the algorithm beast, so, give us likes, hypes, comments, subscribes, etc., whatever. Make sure to also share this video with any friends you have interested in the tabletop RPG, or any 14 friends in general. And anywhere you see RPG content discussed, like I said, if we get a good response to this, we'll run up some more videos, because I do like doing this sort of content. This kind of took me, I want to say 3-ish months from, start to finish of, getting the book, reading the book cover to cover, structuring the script, and then recording the script. It would have taken me less, but there was some other video work that came up urgently in the middle of my work there. Also, I think I was sick for a week or two in the middle of producing this one also. Anyway, share it, give it some love. Maybe we can start rattling some sabers for digital support for this thing. But also, if you're seeing this video on this channel, we do some more content that you might like if you're watching this one randomly. This just pops up in your feed. We release actual play recordings of our tabletop sessions pretty frequently, usually once a week. No FF14 RPG yet, obviously. That's part of why I made this video, but soon, hopefully, after having this done, and I can start taking some notes and working on some, summaries for players to look at. And we have many other fun systems already. Additionally, not a poser about 14 either on this channel. We stream that also usually weekly on Wednesday, which should be the day this video comes out. So you can go back and check all my VODs for basically my entire journey from A Realm Reborn to the current Dawn Trail patch and everything in between. We also have a Discord, links in the video description. We play 14 on there pretty regularly. We do have a free company and also just some general fans. You can come hang out. And I will end this by saying not only can you support us through channel memberships, but by letting you know about our wonderful, beautiful patrons, TM, who make videos like this possible. We have a variety of tiers over on Patreon, and you can get videos like this one early. You can get audio of our various releases like actual plays, and at higher levels, you can get some on-air shoutouts like Added to Harp, Blacklist OG, Call Me Zed, Carlos, Dragon, GDV9000, Rise of Kenji, Rogue Ramen, and Sharvor, and also all of our other wonderful, beautiful patrons and listeners. If you want to see us do more, consider supporting us on Patreon. That's it. Goodbye, everybody.